on the conflict in that particular statement. The corridor, right from India to the heart of Western Europe, shall be another defining takeaway from the summit. The story behind the success of India, India's message to the world of inclusive growth and sustainable development, much more that has been achieved through this summit, G20 summit here in the national capital. We talk about that in the next 60 minutes.
G20 समिट के समापन की घोषणा करता हूं। वन अर्थ, वन फैमिली, वन फ्यूचर का रोड मैप सुखद हो।
India did its utmost for its presidency of the G20 to serve unity and peace and send across a message of unity.
G20 is a G20 that is exceptionally very well organized.
Well, how is it that India was able to cement this success? How is it that Prime Minister Modi and the Indian diplomacy was able to get different conflicting sides or the warring factions to agree to a joint statement? Many said that it was an impossibility. There were critics who were arguing that the fact that the Russians and the Chinese head of the state are not present for the summit could be a dampener. Putting all of that criticism aside, this summit has been a historic success. How has this success been achieved? And how did we cement it? Joining us on the broadcast is our very special guest. We have Dr. Jitendra Singh, the Union Minister, joining us on the broadcast. Sir, good evening. It's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Let's begin by talking about this immense success of G20. India gave a message of one world, one family, inclusive growth and development, and the manner in which it has been reflected across different platforms, whether it's a joint statement, bilaterals, or different deals that have been talked about, it has been a story of historic success. How do you see this success? What is the idea behind it? What led to this big success?
I think my very first thought is that it is an extension of what the Honorable Prime Minister Shri Narendra Modi ji had envisaged, and what he also said in his remarks yesterday. There's a need to transform global trust deficit into global trust. And it's a matter of pride that Prime Minister Modi has been an instrument of creating that kind of global trust, which has enabled this unanimous agreement. And India G20, I would rather put it in a single sentence, saying that it symbolizes inclusiveness in its best form. It's true to the theme of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, which you were referring. It's also true to Modi mantra of Sabka Saath, Sabka Vikas, Sabka Vishwas, Sabka Prayas. And it's been a statesmanly lead taken by India by way of, for example, including African Union into G20, now converting G20 into G21. And as we move on in the course of conversation, I think most important, what has personally also given me a sense of great delight and pride, is the Bharat Middle East Europe corridor that has been agreed upon, which is something which was possibly not contemplated or even visualized till a few years ago.
Absolutely. You've raised a lot of issues, so I want to tackle them one by one. You spoke of public trust. The fact that the Global South has been able to find its voice like never before on a platform like G20, and India has been leading that conversation, that discourse on multiple platforms, including G20. How do you see that trust building up at an international level on the leadership of the Prime Minister, on the leadership of the present government, the commitment of the present government to the sustainable development goals, inclusive growth, not just here in India, but across the world?
Of course, now converting G20 to 21 is itself an achievement behind which not much of effort has gone in. Which is because in the diplomatic parlays, everything is not made public before the time happens to do so. But there's not much of effort gone down by the Prime Minister himself and also the team inspired by him. Now, as far as including all the nations, as you mentioned, is concerned, I said, as I said in my opening remarks, G20, India, is one of the finest examples of inclusiveness in its best form. And I think that is also reflected in the manner in which the joint declaration or the Delhi declaration was not evasive. It didn't mince words. It was forthright, frank, honest, and yet it was meaningful. And I think that is best reflected in reference to the Ukraine conflict or the Ukraine war, under the subheading Planet, People, Peace, Prosperity. So under the subhead of Planet, People, Peace, Prosperity, you would, if you go through that keenly, you would realize that G20 does very modestly admit that the resolution of a conflict situation or a war or a geopolitical contradiction is not its mandate. G20's mandate primarily is to act as a forum for international cooperation. But yet it is indulging because, for very important reasons, that the human beings tend to suffer in the aftermath of any conflict situation or in the aftermath of war, just as they also suffer in the aftermath of a pandemic like we experience in COVID. And therefore the declaration also makes it very candidly assertive that we are highlighting human suffering and the negative impacts of war regard to the global food, energy, supply chains, etc., which tend to get adversely affected. And therefore, in a way, a situation like this also would end up causing economic distress, and taking cognizance of the concerns related to economic well-being of the population is important mandate of G20. And therefore, it very wisely, very diligently also justifies its indulgence without making it appear that it is interfering into any kind of a geopolitical controversy.
Sir, you very rightly point out the humanitarian approach that G20 as a platform has taken. And it also resonates with the Indian foreign policy position that India had taken vis-a-vis the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Many Western nations wanted us to take a very strong position when that conflict had begun or few months into that conflict. But India was very clear in terms of its approach. While we remain quote-unquote neutral in many ways, when it came to humanitarian aid or extending any kind of relief to the people who were suffering in the war, India was one of the first countries to come forward. The manner in which G20 resolution was adopted or that joint statement could be agreed upon is a reaffirmation of India's position. Do you see that as world agreeing that we need to take a far more humane approach when it comes to this particular war or crisis?
Of course, to sum up what you are saying in a single sentence, there's a expression used: today's era must not be that of war. Today's era must not be that of war, which is also used in the Bali declaration earlier. So that is how the G20 declaration connects itself or its concerns to the possibilities of distress being caused economically and socially to the world population, and thereby it addresses the issue of conflict not as somebody who's come forward to act as an arbitrator. So that is one aspect. The other part is connecting the same, and I'm sure you'll maybe taking up in the next question. This corridor thing actually has been very, it's put me nostalgically back to the Kabuliwala days, because that is something which the post-partition India would have, always looked for. It must have been the quest of the population, which has seen the aftermath of the partition happening, when about 10 to 20 lakh people got killed. Twice the number of them went homeless, and suddenly Pakistan comes in and then vetoes our request to overfly the zone. So the entire corridor gets cut off, which was actually a route of trade in the pre-partition days. So I think that's a huge restoration of a historical situation which had been somewhere got deranged in the agony and tragedy of the biggest exchange of population and the biggest partition that is known in the recent history of the world. And again, Prime Minister Modi will be credited for a long time for having introduced this concept of what is now being popularly described as the Bharat Middle East Europe corridor.
True, very true. And let me take the cue for the next question from there, as you said. India, one of the richest civilizations in the world historically for centuries, has always been a very important destination when it comes to trade and economic activity. Talking about nostalgia, the Silk Route or various historical facets will point out how India has been a significant country, an important power when it comes to furthering trade, prosperity, and also cooperation between these different countries. But many talk about the messaging to the Chinese. The Chinese Belt and Road Initiative is often seen as antithetical, as something which is not very good for the sovereignty of many countries. There are various criticisms around that Belt and Road Initiative. Do you see this particular corridor as an alternative to the Chinese model?
Yeah, there are two aspects to it. One, that you are referring to the strategical aspect. So strategically, I think this decision addresses the issue twofold. A, the concern about Chinese connectivity projects. From time to time you get to know or you get to hear about Chinese, working on some design. So that is part A. The second part is it also eliminates that Pakistan's veto by which it would refuse you to allow overland access and thereby cause you tremendous hardship. So that is the strategy part. But of course, going back to the trade, of course, as you rightly mentioned, the pre-partition times, the early 20th century when we had this Silk Route, that of course, but in addition to that, over the last 70, 80 years with the turn of the century, there are new dimensions to the trade. And now, as you would recall, Europe had committed itself to spend as much as 300 million euros from the year 2021 to 27. So I think this will also facilitate, this corridor will facilitate that kind of European investment in infrastructural development along that corridor, whether it be the formation of in the form of laying down of rail tracks or putting in place shipping connectivity or even the optic fibers.
Sure.
And it's going to have besides the trade, it's also, I'm sure, going to have effect on periodic temperatures rising in the form of some insurgency pockets appearing in this zone, because the more the connectivity in the Arabian Peninsula, I think more the prospects of disturbances of geopolitical nature also tending to remain under somewhat reasonable control.
Sure, sure. So coming back to the agenda of inclusive growth and what India has to offer, the success of Chandrayaan-3 is an example how with limited resources Indians can do so much, and that's an example that the entire world has very keenly watched. Another thing that invoked a lot of interest at G20, and it was much talked about, is the kind of digital payment infrastructure India has been able to create with very limited resources, the deep penetration of it despite limited spending capacity of the Indians. When it comes to these examples, these models of growth and inclusiveness, do you think there's an example that the rest of the world can follow, the developed and the developing countries?
I'm sure. I think India has emerged as a role model. I mean, this is, as someone who is connected with the Ministry of Space, this is the question being asked day in and day out. Even during the G20 summit, most of the delegates were keen to understand how could we manage Chandrayaan at a cost of just 600 crore vis-a-vis the Russian mission, which was 16,000 crore, yet not successful as they had planned it to be. And that is because we have tried to make up for the financial resources through our cerebral resources. Lot much of diligence, lot much of brain work in strategizing our technology missions has been invested. So, like for example, even if you take the case of Chandrayaan, it was when it took off from here, it took the advantage of the gravitational forces, spent a lot of time, 10-20 times going around the Earth, in the orbit of Earth. Then finally it went into the lunar orbit, and then it was almost as much as about 40 circles around the moon. So we were in a way saving on fuel by strategizing our itinerary, though it took a little longer. So I think that is why I have now been saying this with a certain amount of conviction for quite some time, that India never lacked acumen, never lacked potential,
Yeah.
never lacked the human resource, even in those days when we were devoid of resources complete. Now, of course, with Prime Minister Modi having come in, there's much of investment happening in technology endeavors. We have the private sector opening up. The space, for example, has been opened up to all the stakeholders. We have as much as more than 150 startups. We have this Anusandhan National Research Foundation, which is going to give room to investment of as much as 60-70% from the non-government sources. All this has happened in the recent times with the path-breaking decisions taken by Prime Minister Modi.
Yeah.
But even in those days when we were devoid of all this, we were not devoid of the human resource.
Sure.
And I think that's what makes us create these role models of cost-effective technology experiments. And also because we are a heterogeneous country, and we have learned to apply these technologies in heterogeneous conditions. Like, for example, our Swamitva program, one of the finest examples, again being emulated by the world over, is being talked about, because you no longer need to access the revenue officers.
Yeah.
You can map your farm, map your land. It's all space technology. Similarly, your DBT. Now, just remember, this Digital India was announced by Prime Minister Modi long before COVID happened, and nobody could foresee that COVID was in the offing. But when COVID actually happened, this proved to be a boon. So we were at an advantage compared to several other nations, because we had already created a mechanism by which we could transfer the money, even when the supply chains or the other mechanisms had faltered because of the COVID or had gone berserk because of the pandemic.
True, true. You've said this in public domain and on social media that India is no longer the lesser cousin. You said this in context of space research and technology, and I argue that this holds true also on the global platform. I mean, there are various superpowers that run this world and the geopolitics of this world, but the soft power of India has proved to be highly persuasive.
Absolutely, and I have no hesitation once again to give credit to Prime Minister Modi. He made the countrymen realize the power of soft power. The power of soft power. And when I say we are no longer lesser cousins, it does have a literal meaning in the sense I tell you.
Yeah.
I'll give you a scientific reason for why I say so. Till about few years back, we were not at the same pace, at the same level as other nations as far as technology advancement is concerned. And the two most notable examples are that of television and computers, which happened in this country nearly 1.5 decades later. Now, for example, America had television in 1950s. Their presidential elections, the most famous presidential election of 1960, when Kennedy turned the tables on Nixon through a TV debate, was primarily because of a television debate. But we had never heard of debate of a television happening in those days. We got it in somewhere in 70s, that too in the form of a short-term chitrahar or some kind of a weekly program. So also was the case of computers.
Sure.
But now today, for example, take the case of National Quantum Mission. We are one of the few nations, we are into quantum technology in the R&D in the same level.
Yeah.
Space, we are at the same level. So gone are the days when we would take lead, or we would follow others, or others would have developed the technology, applied it, and the technology would become popular there, and then the thought would occur to us to also to adopt it and to realize its merits and advantages or benefits. It's no longer so. In fact, we are sometimes ahead of others in applying certain technologies which they then pick up. And yes, again, the example is that of space technology. Today we are applying, unlike many other countries, our space technology is not only confined to the sending up of rockets. We are using it in the building of smart cities, in laying down of rail tracks, in roads, buildings, in telemedicine, of course, in agriculture sector in a big way, which is not happening in many other countries. So we are actually now laying down cues and leads for others to follow. Therefore, I said we have the confidence to say we are no longer lesser cousin.
We are no longer the lesser cousin. I agree with that, sir. Today is not the day to talk about the critics or the naysayers, but I want to indulge you into this conversation and this particular question. Many argue that G20, would it be a success or not? The Russian and the Chinese, the head of the state, are not here for the G20 summit. Is this a snub of some sort? And the success of the entire summit was doubted upon. The kind of consensus that has been achieved under the leadership of India at the G20 forum, the kind of key agendas that have been put on the table, various bilateral trade agreements that have been talked about, What would you say to the critics of the government who were not so sure or certain of the success of the summit?
I think again they are not able to understand the kind of craftsmanship that India has come to acquire over the years.
Yeah.
So they are still looking, some of them still looking at India through the prism of yesterday, as I said. And many of us within the country also are still victims of that hangover, the colonial hangover. Even in our scriptures, it is said that it takes 3 generations to change. तीन पीढ़ियों के बाद संस्कार बदलता है. So we are still to get out of that mindset that it's no longer the India which was, taken for granted and which was looked down upon. For example, till a few years ago, the issues like climate concern, the issues like biofuel. We have today, I think that's one other achievement of this summit. It is India which has taken a lead and the initiative to form a biofuel alliance, which is going to be the alliance of the future,
Sure.
and the alliance of the 21st century for the rest of the 75 years. We have a huge biofuel resource. It is we who are telling the world now. So I think it's for us also and for the critics also to come out of the prism of yesterday and to start looking at India through the prism of today and maybe even tomorrow.
Absolutely. That's very well said. Dr. Jitendra Singh, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for sharing your thoughts on this very special broadcast tonight. And indeed, G20 has been a thumping historic success under the leadership of India. We'll talk about various other takeaways, what has been achieved and what lies ahead. What is the sort of messaging that India has given to the rest of the world? That and much more on the other side of a very quick break. Stay tuned.
राशि की स्कूल फीस
Welcome back. You're watching Viewpoint, and we continue to talk about the G20 summit that came to a conclusion today. It was a huge historic success under the leadership of India. Prime Minister Modi also laid down that how India played a critical role in terms of forging an inclusive growth agenda and to ensure that all the partners of G20, all the member nations, come to a consensus despite stinging stark differences, especially on the Russia-Ukraine crisis. To talk about the various facets of that joint statement that has been put out, what has been achieved and what lies ahead, joining us on the broadcast is our panel and our special guests who join us this evening here on Viewpoint. We have Dr. Sangeeta Reddy, who's the chair of the G20 Empower India panel. We also have Mr. Rajat Dhar, who's the director of the Indian Investor Federation. Mr. Mohandas Pai, who's the chairperson of the Manipal Global Education, is also with us. Professor Brahmachalani, who's a strategic affairs expert, is joining us on the broadcast. We also have with us Professor Christopher Clary, who is the Associate Professor of Political Science at the University of Albany. Thank you all for joining us on the broadcast. Good evening to all of you. Dr. Reddy, coming to you first. The inclusive growth agenda has been highlighted by India. The inclusion of the global south in this and the manner in which India has put forward the concerns of the smaller nations. How critical will India's role be for the times to come in shaping this agenda, in taking these issues forward?
So clearly this is a watershed moment, a historic moment in the history of the world and of G20 itself. Having started primarily as a body or a group of nations which came together for better economic progress, India has really raised the level of the conversation.
Yeah.
With the categorization of the strategy of, one world and moving on to say it's one future and one earth. It brought inclusivity, sustainability, and the fact that everyone should be part of this and everyone's voice is important. So I congratulate Prime Minister Modi, the Sherpa, the MEA, all the ministers and everybody who led the different initiatives.
Yeah.
I believe it's important that leaders from all over the world understood that it's time for a new world order. I want to especially call out the fact that many of the initiatives, including, I think, the historic inclusion of Africa, the focus on the Green Energy Pact, the building of infrastructure to connect nations, the very, very critical focus on women-led development.
Yes.
And all these are significant parts of the dialogue. The fact that it was added into the leadership declaration and the fact of a working group focusing on cross-cutting initiatives to enhance women's participation in the formal workforce. All these are very significant and augur very well for the development of the world. So I'm extremely excited. Healthcare being my subject, I must also say that healthcare played an important part of the leadership declaration.
Yeah.
And all the points which were deliberated of equitable healthcare, healthcare within the reach of everyone, cooperation on research, vaccines and drugs. And during the health summit, there was the historic launch by the minister of the health portal for medical value travel or people being able to access care in India because India is delivering world-class global outcomes at 1/10 of global prices.
Absolutely.
So all these are very significant and I think overall it's been a fantastic year of India's presidency and I'm excited for the results, the success, as well as the potential of the future impact.
Absolutely. Let me take that point forward with Mr. Rajat Dhar as well, the inclusive growth agenda. Mr. Dhar, two aspects I found critical, and please add to that if I'm missing a point there. The role of MSMEs and the leading role in innovation that perhaps private enterprises or the startups can play is a story that the entire developing world is very keenly looking forward to, and that resonated in that particular statement as well. When it comes to the role of the micro or the small industries, which are very pivotal in economies like India and for other developing nations as well, what kind of agenda, what kind of inclusive agenda can they really take forward?
Thank you. And while we're talking about the MSMEs or even micro and small scale, let me tell you, when we talk about the southern world, we had an experience where we did the Vietnam-India conclave. And you would be surprised to know many smaller units based out of Mohali, Chandigarh, Kapurthala. And after COVID, they were trying to work towards getting their orders from China, and they were looking to set up their manufacturing facilities in Vietnam. So if we take that as an example, and we are seeing that the whole African continent is getting opened, there is a huge scope for the Indian corporates, small and medium scale enterprises to enter into, because the market is absolutely huge. The
Sure.
only concern that we listen to or we can have is as far as the political instability goes there. If the political things are taken control of, I think it is one of the, and micro and small cap industries, trade associations, trade bodies can enable those companies to engage with the business association there. Like we had also engaged with the trade bodies from Ethiopia, for
Sure.
that matter, in the recent past. So that would be in terms, as far as the startups innovation is concerned, it has to be done at the two level. When we are talking about the fintech space, because financial inclusion, because also being one of the core fundamentals or the
yes.
basis of this, fintech space in India is marred by, you can say, profitability issues. They are doing really good, but to come into a profitable level, they have a long gestation period. So we will
Yeah.
have to work where the established banks in India, like one of the head of from the ICICI Banker, he told that it is a time when big Indian banks and fintech companies can combine together with MSMEs or micro enterprises, can create an ecosystem or a supply chain where the African market can be optimized.
Yeah.
And therefore, the agenda of the G20 can be realized through that maneuver.
All right. I take that point forward with Mr. Mohandas Pai as well. Mr. Pai, before we talk about the much talked about corridor from India right up to the heart of the Western Europe and how critical and important it's going to be, financial inclusion and discipline is something that finds its place in that joint statement that has been put out. And more importantly, it talks about the role of regulators, central bank, ensuring that inflation in the developed and the developing economies is kept under control and check. When it comes to those critical areas in terms of having some kind of financial inclusion, what kind of steps have been taken? Do you see any tangible progress that has been made on that particular front, or a blueprint that has been put forward that can be followed in the times to come?
Well, I think India has put forward the concept of digital public goods. I think it's important for the world to understand that if you have digital monopolies in certain critical areas, you end up with big tech companies having the monopoly, which could squeeze out competition. And India's success in UPI, India's success in the use of Aadhaar to open 500 million accounts has been a success, has been a great role model for them to follow.
Yeah.
I think the G20 has also said that we need more inclusive climate finance. And for that, they have increased the capital of agreed to increase the capital of IMF and World Bank by $200 billion to remove capital constraints, which I think is very important. They also said that they're going to work on tax issues because they want to ensure that taxation comes to the host country. And today, digital tax is all over the place.
Sure.
So they're ensuring that taxation is also done on digital goods, which can be put into tax-exempt countries.
Yes.
And over the period of time, they made sure that tax havens have come down by getting in other instruments. They also spoke about debt forgiveness for Ghana, Zambia, and Ethiopia, which is very good because many of these countries are suffering from an excess of debt and needs debt forgiveness. So I think overall, there was something for society in the form of inclusion using technology, which India is a role model. There was the expansion of the global financial system and discussion on reforming the IMF and the World Bank. There has been progress on tax issues, ensuring that digital goods are taxed. And that's going to be a major issue because a large part of the value added is the form of digital goods. And likewise, debt forgiveness. I think in the financial area, there have been very much progress. And I think this is pretty good. But remember, all these have been works in progress. Many decisions have been taken because of India's push. India held 220 meetings, right?
Yes.
And India also explained the need to reform the global financial architecture. So I think all these things have been done, and there's certainly very good progress.
There's certainly very good progress. Professor Brahmachalani, I want to stay in this space and talking about in terms of trade, finance, fiscal growth and development, inclusive agenda, what can be achieved. particularly about cryptocurrency. This is, or the crypto assets as they are called in today's parlance. They have troubled various sovereign governments. There have been much talk about it. It has been argued that here in India, presently the regulation is very patchy. There's much more that needs to be done. There were union ministers who have spoken about this issue. But when it comes to crypto assets, there is a need for the regional platforms and to have some kind of multilateral arrangement or agreement as to how these assets are traded across border. In that respect, has there been significant progress that has been made?
I would like to add a note of caution.
Sure.
Because we have a very forward-looking 37-page consensus document that seeks to address all the pressing global challenges. On paper, the document looks very impressive. But we should not forget the G20 has a track record of not being able to implement promises made by its leaders. I think the New Delhi document has many pious commitments by member states. Implementing those commitments is going to be a challenge given the growing international divisiveness that we currently face. Some years ago, the G20 summit agreed to reduce coal use, but since then, the use of coal has actually increased markedly across the world. So reaching a broad consensus on a host of promises is one thing.
Sure.
But implementing those promises, whether they are about crypto assets or about multilateral development banks or debt relief, putting them into practice will demand global unity, which is hard to come by today, given the widening international divisions.
So I take that note of caution with due respect, and I think we must talk about this facet as well, that how much of that is really going to be implemented. I'll dedicate the last few minutes of the debate on that, but I also want to bring in Professor Christopher Clary into the discussion and talk about various things that have been promised, how much of that really be implemented is for the times to come, as Professor Brahmachalani really pointed out. But Professor Clary, when it comes to financial inclusion, the role of MSMEs and the inclusion of the Global South, various countries, the global southern countries whose interests were not really at the center stage at these regional platforms have now been put. How significant is that inclusion? And from the point of view of economic aid, development, growth, sustainable growth for these lesser privileged countries, what kind of promise does G20 or the member nations really hold?
You know, ultimately, these sorts of summits are reflecting the interest of the states that are there. You know, India has done an incredible job of event management and diplomacy to get back to this day. But whether or not the poor countries of the world, we can call them the South or otherwise,
sure,
benefit from these sorts of statements has very little to do with the summitry, to be honest. It has to do with how fearful the U.S. is about the competition with China, right? A lot of these pushes do reflect concerns in Europe and the United States about the equity and inclusion of the prior order. But realistically, it is about competing with China for influence in countries where U.S. and Western influence used to be assured.
Yes.
And so, you know, building a new order where Japan and India have a very prominent seat at the table to help make sure that China doesn't gain inroads all over the world, that's the undercurrent of a lot of this summitry that allows for these ambitious packages to be joined.
Okay.
And if China continues to slip, then you may see less interest, honestly, from the West in competing in these places, because countries are not prone, India including India, to give away assets or money or expend resources unless they really have to, because they'd rather use those resources at home.
That's very candidly put, and taking forward that note of caution as well that Professor Chalani was talking about, I want to take these points back to Mr. Rajat Dhar and Mr. Mohandas Pai. Mr. Dhar, a reality check on what can be really achieved. It's great that we have a consensus. Many thought that it was impossible to get a consensus or a joint statement. With the efforts of the Prime Minister, with the efforts of the diplomats, it has been achieved, and the member nations agreed to come forward. But let's talk about the trade corridor that has been much talked about. How significant it's going to be. Is it really about keeping a check on China, or one should see it as a road, as a trade road which is being developed, which does not have anything to do with the Belt and the Road Initiative? Rajadhar.
Okay. Let me be very frank and candid here, because the DNA of India has absolutely changed since 2014 when the new government came. And we should not be defensive even if we say that, yes, it is a counter to Belt and Road Initiative, either explicitly or implicitly. Yes, it is. And we should be very strict and candid with it, because this is the time we as Indians need to exert our dominance into a region. That is the reason why in Kashmir or Arunachal Pradesh, different G20 events were held. Why it was done there? Initially, it was not done because of the same reasons. While obviously it will have economic benefits and all other things, it will be good for the infrastructure companies, the financial bodies, so on and so forth, trade, everything. But it will be more of a, you can say, it will be more of a communication. It is like a javelin piercing right through the heart of China when we are talking about this. So, it is like a statement. It's like a slogan. So just getting your word across. And I think India is the only country in the whole Asia and Middle Eastern who has the guts to stand against China. And this is the time when we need to do that.
All right. Mr. Mohandas Pai, there is a note of caution that has come in from certain learned guests that we have with us on the broadcast. And there is indeed optimism that Rajat and the various other experts have spoken about. When it comes to the real implementation of the promises that have been made, what is the track record? And is there really evidence for us to be far more hopeful than what we have achieved in the future, considering that when you saw the joint statement was not a possibility, consensus was not a possibility, that has happened?
Well, the track record has been patchy, which is true, but it is a statement of intent of various countries. For example, take the new trade corridor. Saudi Arabia is going to be a great player there. Now, Prince Salman is in India. He'll be here tomorrow as a state guest. And his strategy is very clear to make sure that Saudi Arabia goes away from the hegemony of the United States. And instead of being driven by the United States, it has a more independent policy. Now, there is a fear that Saudi Arabia is shifting towards the Chinese, because you saw President Xi get Saudi Arabia and Iran for a talk. We have seen movement there. The Americans had the Abraham Accord too. Now, having the trade corridor through Saudi Arabia will improve trade with Saudi Arabia and make sure that the connection between the East, India and other countries, and Europe through a land route, and that is important. And that could be a bilateral meeting that will happen, which had the blessings of a multilateral forum like the G20. Because obviously Europe and the United States have blessed this, and I think that's going to be there. So what I would see is many things have happened which has great impact on very many countries. It's up to those countries to use the consensus driven here in G20 to drive great advantage. For example, debt relief for Ethiopia, Ghana, and Zambia, right? Now that's been agreed. So they must take it forward and work it out with the IMF, and I think it'll work. Increase in the capital for IMF and World Bank has been in the works for long. Now that is extremely positive. The impact of technology like UPI, now this will be interesting for the countries in the developed world to reduce the cost of transferring money for small money, right? Because people pay a lot of money, and here is a tool that can slowly develop into a global system as an alternate to SWIFT. SWIFT is controlled by the West. You also have the global South look at UPI and others as a tool, and digital public goods as a tool to ensure that the global digital monopolies do not dominate. So there are many things. It's up to individual nations and others to take this and push it forward. And to me, these are the interesting things that could really have an impact. But yeah, the record is very patchy in terms of its global impact, in terms of the consensus that has been developed. Consensus is very good. But how do you implement on the ground? That is, that's going to take time and is a bit patchy.
Professor Clary, do you share that sense of skepticism that yes, these are great promises that have been made, but when it comes to real geopolitics, they might not be implemented in the same spirit?
Sadly, countries are not known for altruism. So, what is different about the current moment? It's not just India's ability to pull off this sort of pageantry. It's the fact that India's economy is growing well. As long as India's economy is growing well, it's going to be courted by the global powers.
Yes.
And if the Indian economy starts to falter, as other economies have, this is a very challenging interest rate climate that makes Indian economic growth all the more remarkable. If India's economy starts to falter, it's going to struggle to continue to gain as much sort of ideational market share in the world. But this is an impressive moment. India is the fastest growing large economy on the planet. And India now has a clear seat at the global high table. That has been true for a long time. India has used to be a key representative of initially the non-aligned states, then the developing world, and now India tries and wants to be a bridge between those countries of the global south as well as the established great powers. And India has good relations with all the great powers except for China, but China really matters. So we'll see how this all plays out.
All right, Professor Jilani, I want to take the last word from you. India's position at that high table on the global platform, has that been consolidated with the New Delhi summit?
Definitely. This was a high point in Indian diplomacy. The summit managed to achieve not just a joint communique, the New Delhi Declaration, the 37-page document that I mentioned. That was not the only achievement of this summit. The real value of any G20 summit lies in it serving as a venue for bilateral meetings on the margins. It is through these bilateral meetings that you manage to conclude deals. The real diplomacy in New Delhi was not in the summit hall. It was on the margins, where various world leaders were holding bilaterals. Modi held more than 15 bilateral meetings with various G20 leaders, but he did not hold a bilateral meeting with the Chinese premier in a snub to China. But he did hold very important bilateral meetings. As far as the US President Joe Biden is concerned, he played a low-key role at this summit, focusing his attention largely on further warming the relations with India.
Okay.
He has developed a personal rapport with Modi, and today the U.S.-India relationship looks very promising. We don't know what was agreed upon.
Okay.
Apart from the fact that the two, along with Saudi Arabia and UAE, decided that they would work together on this transportation corridor to Europe via the Middle East. That by itself was an important accomplishment.
Sure. Thank you all for joining us on the broadcast, and thank you for sharing that views. But I want to take the last word from Dr. Sangeeta Reddy. Dr. Reddy, you are the chair of the G20 Empower India panel, so I must ask you, on the motto of Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, one world, one family, something that India has been talking about, how has India's soft power been so persuasive to get all the member nations on the same panel to build this consensus?
So clearly, I think you answered the entire positioning in your question itself. There is a great future for India, and I'm extremely happy that I think the future is not one which is dominated merely on the purchasing power parity or the size of the economy. Yes, we've become number 5 in terms of our GDP. We're moving to number 3.
Yes.
But those are not the factors which are getting highlighted. The factors getting highlighted are a new thought leadership. And that is true leadership and true power. It is the leadership of saying, let everyone in the world count. Let us start working today for the environment. A leadership declaration which said that we must together achieve our SDG goals. So I think it's critical things like this which is showing a new world order, a new methodology. And India clearly is saying this not just as a slogan, but a reflection of our cultural ethos. Like you mentioned, Vasudeva Kutumbakam.
Yes.
This is our cultural ethos. Carrying this cultural ethos with a voice and a confidence and a strategy to back it. So I think one of the busiest pavilions, busiest areas in the Bharat Pavilion was the showcasing of the digital public goods,
Yes.
the RBI platform, the UPI. These are, so what we're saying is that we have solutions. Come share them, come
Yeah.
copy them, come buy from us if it's the vaccine. So these solutions, come, access healthcare for your people by sending them for cost-effective care.
Yeah.
These are the type of things which are solutions for leaders who come from across the world, need to take back to their countries because they must create impact for their people. So we gave them solutions, we
Yeah.
gave them thought leadership, and we gave them friendship and a hope for the future.
Absolutely. Dr. Reddy, it's always a pleasure to have you on the broadcast. And a big thank you to all our guests as well who were joining this evening, slipping into a very short break. But up next on the other side, we speak with the President and CEO of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum, Mukesh Aghi, on the strides India has made at the helm of G20. Stay tuned. Welcome back. You're watching Viewpoint, and we get you another special conversation. Joining us on the broadcast is Mr. Mukesh Aghi, who's the President and CEO of US-India Strategic Partnership Forum. Sir, thank you so much for speaking with us. Thank you, Mr. Aghi, for joining us on the broadcast. My first question to you: India building a consensus in a fractured world. G20 has been an immense success. Your thoughts on the critical areas of cooperation that have been identified, whether it's infrastructure or technology, in that joint statement?
Well, this is a crowning moment for India and its diplomacy to be able to build a consensus in a very fractured world. China was abstaining, Russia was not there, and you had certain opposition, but to be able to get a consensus, it is a crowning moment for India. Now, from a development perspective, we talked about financing on climate. We talked about the Middle East, Europe, India corridor on railway links itself. We talked about the earlier on the biofuel alliances also. So I think we will see a growing momentum, especially on financing on climate, picking up substantially. So it is a success story for India, and I think India needs to celebrate that.
Indeed. Your thoughts on this special infrastructure corridor, which is being talked about from India right to the heart of Europe, how critical it's going to be, and is it really an alternative to the Chinese Belt and Road Initiative, like many argue it is?
Well, you don't want to compare with BRI because that was very, very predatory. Every project you look at is in trouble and countries are in debt. This one talks about financing coming from Saudis, technology coming from the Europeans, and then the engineering and manpower coming from India. So it's a very collaborative, cooperative deal. But more important is geopolitically, it has an impact. If there's a war and closure of Persian Gulf, then this becomes an alternative to supply goods. So geopolitically, economically, technologically, it's a win for the region itself.
Indeed. India-US strategic ties, especially on various trade bilateral issues, has only deepened in the last few decades. In fact, the last one decade has been marked by increasing cooperation between the two countries. G20 summit, the role that the summit plays in terms of further emboldening these ties.
Well, I think it is a win-win partnership. It's a partnership which is based on the geopolitics, and China is a key factor there. It's a partnership which is based on economic issues. You have US companies getting harassed in China, so they're looking for secure supply chain. India becomes an alternative. It's a partnership of market access, where US companies now have more access to the Indian market as it grows in its purchasing power, and Indian companies always had access to the US market. But more important is that you have a very large Indian diaspora in America, over 5 million, one of the most affluent and most educated and most engaged in civic duties in America. And their affiliation with India continues. They will keep on putting the pressure on either administration, either the Democratic or Republican, to ensure the relationship continues. So I think this is a relationship which will continue for a long time. It will get broader, deeper, and successful.
All right. Mr. Aghi, it's always a pleasure to have you on the show. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sparing your time and joining us on the broadcast on Viewpoint tonight. Well, with that, it's a wrap on this edition of Viewpoint. Shivani Gupta joins you with Plain Speak. Thank you for watching.
Welcome everyone. Thanks a lot for staying with us. You're watching Plain Speak with me, Shivani Gupta. The G20 summit has concluded and the presidency gavel has been handed over officially to Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva. Day 2 of the summit began with the G20 leaders gathering at Rajghat to pay tribute to Mahatma Gandhi. The leaders, along with PM Modi, laid ceremonial wreaths at the Gandhi Memorial and held a free plantation ceremony at Bharat Mandapam. After this, series of bilateral meetings were held with G20 nations where several things were discussed. The big takeaway of the summit, of course, was the call to end